History of Persia is a Hopful Media podcast production.
What's the easiest choice you can make? Window instead of middle seat? Picking a vendor who sends a great gift basket? Outsourcing business tasks you hate? What about selling with Shopify? Whether you're selling a little or a lot, Shopify helps you do your thing, however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage? Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling scented soap or offering outdoor outfits, Shopify helps you sell. Wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/try. Go to shopify.com/try now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in. Shopify.com/try.
Hello everyone, welcome to the History of Persia, Episode 2, Indo-Iranians, Remastered. Last time we explored the world the Persians would inherit, following the major powers of West Asia. Today I'll bring the Persians themselves up to speed as we explore how exactly tribes that became Persians actually ended up in Persia. You will remember that the area of modern Iran that eventually became the Persian home province of Parsa was ruled by the Elamites, a culture that flourished in the Bronze Age, but mostly agitated against the Assyrians until they were crushed by Ashurbanipal in the Iron Age. Frankly, Episode 2 is the remastered episode that I am most tempted to completely rewrite. I haven't done that, but there are a lot of corrections and additions to the original version. To figure out how we went from Elam to Persia, we should first turn to linguistics. It might seem like an odd place to start studying history, but if any of you are familiar with the phrase Proto-Indo-European, you will probably see where I'm going. Proto-Indo-European refers to an ancient language which is the common ancestor of many, many languages from India to Europe, including English. It is also commonly used to refer to the people who spoke that language. The idea that so many languages across a diverse space were all related was first pioneered in the 1780s by a British philologist in India, which led to the effort to reconstruct Proto-Indo-European and its early descendants dominating 19th century linguistics. Those efforts have actually been largely successful, with thousands of words having been reconstructed based on the words of existing known written languages in Proto-Indo-European, Proto-Germanic, and Proto-Indo-Iranian, among many others. Exactly when, where, and who the Proto-Indo-Europeans were is still something of a debate. There is no written record associated with them. All of the linguistic work is done by going backward from modern and historically documented languages that we do have sources for. As such, we don't know what they would have called themselves, or what they would have been called by their neighbors, if they did happen to get mentioned in ancient writing. The question of when is probably the one with the most precise answer, and I use precise very loosely. Scholars have generally settled on 4,500 BCE to 2,500 BCE as the probable time frame for Proto-Indo-European. This is based on when the first and last historical branches of the Indo-European family tree must have split off. 4500 is the earliest date that makes sense in regard to the Anatolian language family. Though no Anatolian languages are spoken today, this category includes the language of the Hittites, who I mentioned briefly in the last episode, and several other languages spoken in Anatolia prior to the conquests of Alexander the Great during the 4th century BCE, and for a little bit after that. The later date of 2500 is much more relevant to us. That is the time that linguists identify with the latest plausible departure for the youngest branches, Italic, Celtic, and Indo-Iranian. At that point, Proto-Indo-European would have completely broken up and become a series of different languages. Italic includes Latin and all of its Romance language descendants, as well as some others spoken in ancient Italy. Celtic refers to languages such as Welsh or Irish, most of which died out after the conquest by Latin-speaking Romans and the Germanic tribes, but obviously I just listed two that still exist. One theory states that there was actually an Italo-Celtic family, and the two migrated together for some time before diverging, somewhere in Central Europe. However, there is a competing theory that the Celtic languages actually share far too many Indo-Iranian and Slavic traits to actually share ancestry with the Italic family. Instead, the argument goes that the apparent Italic influence on ancient Celtic is actually just Roman influence through Romans documenting the Celtic tribes they encountered. This secondary theory suggests that they might represent a separate, very late westward migration shortly before the last big eastward migrations began. Indo-Iranian is the ancestral language of many northern Indian languages and all of the Iranian language family, including the languages that would be spoken in Persia at the time of the Persian Empire, but also their modern descendants like Modern Persian, aka Farsi, and Kurdish dialects. Where and who are interconnected questions. Because we do not have any written sources, and connecting reconstructed words to archaeology in lieu of writing is more or less impossible, we have to know where they might have lived before suggesting a historical culture to associate with the Proto-Indo-European language. Once upon a time, who the Proto-Indo-Europeans were was actually less of a question. From the end of the 18th century and even slightly into the early 20th century, scholars developed the idea of a warrior race who invaded and conquered Europe, Iran, and India. This was based mostly on European ideas of conquering ancestors and the plethora of words for warfare with common Indo-European roots across many languages. However, as modern scholarship has yielded almost no evidence for a militant invasion of any of those places, but has found evidence for very gradual spread and migration in waves, the idea of a warrior invasion has been largely abandoned. How linguists arrived at that conclusion is really fascinating to me. In reconstructing Proto-Indo-European, they found that certain words across many descendant languages had to do with plants, animals, and their byproducts, all with shared roots. Words for specific types of trees like oak, livestock like horses, sheep, and goats, and other parts of the environment like bees and honey really limit the geographical range we can look at to establish that 4500 to 2500 BCE time period, because they must have lived somewhere that had all of those individual things. Physical archaeological evidence limits us even further. Historically, language spreads with material culture to some degree. And given how ridiculously successful Indo-European languages were, we should expect to see some physical evidence for that culture, or at least cultural influences that spread along with the languages. One of the only places in the world that meets all of those criteria is the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the open and arid grasslands that stretch between the Black and Caspian Seas in modern Ukraine and Russia. Once again, the relevant maps are on the website. The cultural group that appears in the right region at the right time is the Yamnaya culture, or Yamnaya horizon to researchers who feel that culture might be too specific for a group of people whose behavior and relationships we can't actually know. However, we can identify many things. Between the archaeological evidence for the Yamnaya and the linguistic evidence for the Proto-Indo-Europeans, we can deduce that they were a group of nomadic, or at least pastoralist herders of cattle, sheep, and goats. Genetic testing shows that their sheep were some of the first in the world with enough wool to make textiles. They were selectively breeding sheep to get fabric. They also built a few small fortifications on hills, around which they had some modest agriculture. They buried their dead in man-made hills called kurgans, which fortunately for us insulate the remains and possessions buried inside. Those possessions include ceramic pottery, animal remains, and copper, silver, gold, and even bronze ornaments, as well as tools and even some made out of stone and weapons. They were some of the first, or maybe less plausibly the first people to make use of wheeled carts and domesticated horses. It was almost certainly in this part of the world that horses were first successfully domesticated and then spread out to other places. The same is potentially true of wheeled vehicles, at least for that part of the world. Meanwhile, many of their metal goods seem to have been imports, primarily from the Bronze Age kingdoms and empires of Western Asia, which I mentioned at the beginning of the last episode. They were the periphery of the Bronze Age trade network, but nonetheless engaged in it. That leaves us with a fairly detailed picture of the Proto-Indo-European, or Yamnaya if you prefer, people. They herded livestock as they traveled from place to place with their goods in wheeled carts, either riding horses or using them as pack animals. They had spiritual rituals, particularly around death and burial with their kurgans. They used tools made of both metal and stone, but had some idea of metalworking with softer precious metals, and they traded, and by extension probably fought, with the cultures around them. Genetic testing can even tell us that, on average, they had brown eyes, dark hair, and a slightly darker complexion than most modern Europeans. Which really just means they looked like people who live around the Mediterranean. There is much more that can be said about the Proto-Indo-Europeans, but we have to follow the branch that split off and would eventually settle in Iran. If you are still curious about the Indo-European languages and how they spread to Europe, I highly recommend the first 15 or so episodes of the History of English podcast by Kevin Stroud. After that point, he narrows his focus to the Germanic languages and then specifically English. If that interests you, I do also recommend the whole show. It's a really interesting way to learn about English history, not just of the language, but of the place once it starts to exist. If you prefer to read, my primary source of information for this whole section was The Horse, the Wheel, and Language by David Anthony. But moving on, we have to ask, why did they move? These people existed comfortably on the Pontic-Caspian steppe for almost a millennium. Some scholars have suggested that environmental change made it harder to feed their herds. Others have suggested that they were just migrating along trade routes to move to more advantageous locations. Regardless of the specific cause, something started pushing people both east and west. Those who went west obviously entered Europe. Those who went east penetrated further into the steppe. While those that went west were busy becoming the future cultures of Europe, we follow the eastward group. Around 2500 BCE, there is evidence for an eastern migration of the Yamnaya culture, and by around 2100, we refer to the Andronovo horizon. Once again, the word horizon is used to describe a broad material culture over different systems of belief and behavior and lots of other anthropological stuff. Unlike the Yamnaya, we actually can identify some of the subcultures relevant to our story. First came the Sintashta, occupying the steppe to the northeast of the Caspian Sea. They mixed with other groups on their way east and absorbed some material culture that was already in that region, while also innovating new practices. The Sintashta is associated with extravagant sacrifices and kurgan burials, with myriad grave goods in the form of spearheads, arrowheads, chisels, axes, and even early chariots. In fact, the Sintashta culture is theorized as the possible inventors of the true chariot, as opposed to just kind of a cart that any big animal could pull around with an archer. They seem to have remained semi-nomadic pastoralists with their herds, but unlike the Yamnaya, the Sintashta culture is noted for mining and working their own copper on an industrial scale. They traded their metalwork south to Elam, which was in Iran, and Mesopotamia, even beyond that, because those two cultures had an endless demand for bronze material. However, the metalworks and weapons found in Sintashta graves were not just for export and display. There is significant evidence for warfare and competition between different Sintashta groups, possibly driven by disputes over pastures. In addition to a number of weapons found in Sintashta kurgans, the development of chariots really only had one purpose. They also built fortifications, which means they were fortifying themselves against something. Finally, within the kurgan burials, archaeologists have found the remains of people who died strikingly violent deaths, with injuries that match the types of weapons produced by their own culture. Unfortunately, without a written record, we can only guess as to what their wars looked like. The Sintashta culture eventually spread east and south, developing into the Andronovo horizon, which would last in some places until 900 BCE, covering a vast stretch of the steppe east from the Caspian coast all the way to modern Siberia. The culture stayed relatively consistent, but over thousands of years and a huge area, some variations developed. Some placed more importance on horses, others on cattle, some added pigs and camels. Bronze and copper working became more common and more complex. They continued to trade with the empires to their south, prior to the Bronze Age collapse, and their building techniques became more and more intricate as well, incorporating stone and wood underneath of their kurgans and in a few fortifications, instead of just earthworks. Linguistically, this group is identified with the Indo-Iranians, who spoke the Proto-Indo-European language. As I mentioned earlier, this was the linguistic ancestor of the Iranian and Northern Indian or Indo-Aryan language families. Once again, linguists can point to a place and the corresponding material culture to connect a long-dead language by working backwards from the ones that still exist. In this case, the path researchers took was a little more direct than taking evidence from dozens of languages to recreate Proto-Indo-European. There are only two branches, and both became literate relatively early, and before that they both had strong oral traditions that had a tendency to preserve the exact wording rather than adapting pronunciation and grammar as the day-to-day language evolved. Eventually, those very early oral traditions were written down and preserved for us today. The oldest language from either branch is Sanskrit, the ancient language used in northern India, which was written down first in the form of the Vedas, most notably the Rig Veda. These were ancient Indic religious texts containing stories, prayers, and songs. They remain important to many branches of modern Hinduism, but in their earliest form, it's difficult to directly associate them with the idea of being Hindu, at least as we understand it today. The Vedas were first written down sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE, possibly later, but the oral tradition that spawned them is thought to be as old as 1900 BCE, firmly contemporary with the Indo-Iranians. The second branch is another, but slightly younger religious text called the Gathas. The Gathas are part of a larger collection of texts called the Avesta, which is the primary holy book of Zoroastrianism, a religion we will discuss in much, much more detail in later episodes. The Gathas are the oldest part of the Avesta, written in a language termed, somewhat uncreatively, Old Avestan. The hymns that eventually became the Gathas are also thought by linguists to have developed in the mid-2nd millennium, but not to have been written down until after the Rig Veda, probably not actually written down in their current form until around the 4th century CE. To linguists, Sanskrit and Avestan are very closely related languages, meaning that their common Proto-Indo-Iranian parent must have existed not long before either developed on their own. Both texts can be linked back to the Andronovo and Sintashta steppe cultures based on timing and some elements described in the text. These include discussions of livestock and herding activities more in line with pastoralists on the steppe than the cultures of Iran and India that preserved the tradition, as well as descriptions of funeral rites that scholars have suggested refer to kurgan burials, once again, something not present in Iran and India in the later period where these texts were preserved and written down. So now, we have the Indo-Iranians, whose religious traditions eventually ended up in India and Iran, but were currently living well to the north as the Andronovo cultures on the steppe. Once again, our story has to follow migrations. But before we advance any further, I have to make a short digression that just doesn't fit anywhere else. If you listen to my introductory episode, you'll have heard part of this already. I mentioned before that the first research into the Indo-European and Indo-Iranian languages were first studied in the 18th and 19th centuries. However, linguists did not call them Indo-European at the time. Earlier scholars called the linguistic and cultural ancestors of modern European, Indian, and Iranian languages the Aryans. The word Aryan came from the name the authors of both the Avesta and the Vedas used to describe themselves. And in fact, it is also the word that eventually morphed into words like Iran and Iranian. Unfortunately, given the pseudoscience of race and how it was used to promote white supremacy in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the word Aryan became corrupted. In certain circles, most obviously the Nazi Party of Germany, it became associated with a kind of super race, which the Nazis claimed were the ancestors of the Germans, most directly. Of course, we now know that they were horrifyingly and idiotically wrong, but their misuse of the word Aryan and the fact that it wasn't really accurate to the original Indo-Europeans to begin with pushed Aryan out of popular use. Now I'm going to diverge from my original script to explain a topic I kind of glossed over the first time around. I still think it's not entirely relevant to the story I'm telling, but enough people disagree with me that I should include it. While the more famous and well-documented ancient Near Eastern cultures like Assyria, Elam, and Babylon were enjoying their Middle Bronze Age, they were surrounded by other great civilizations. Some, like Egypt, are just as famous, if not more so. Others, like the Hittites, were just beginning to emerge, but would blossom within a few centuries. However, many others are known primarily through archaeological remains and just scattered references in Egyptian or Mesopotamian literature. The Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, or BMAC for short, was a fully developed urbanized agricultural Bronze Age civilization, also known as the Oxus civilization because it was developed along the Amu Darya, known as the Oxus River in antiquity. The Oxus civilization dominated southern Central Asia, mostly Tajikistan and Afghanistan, from about 2300 to 1700 BCE. It had roots in earlier cultural movements in the same region, going all the way back to 3,000 or 4,000 BCE. The Oxus also traded with more famous powers, providing precious stones and tin from the surrounding mountains, and importing luxury goods from Elam and Mesopotamia, as well as the Indus Valley. Unlike the curious civilization of the Indus Valley at the time, the Oxus civilization shows clear evidence for violence, with weapons and burials and impressive fortifications around their cities. Their art style greatly influenced later Iranian cultures, both in Iran and on the steppe, with many of the same elements as the later Scythian animal style that spread from Ukraine to Siberia. Oxus sites also show the first evidence for one of history's most important animals, the Bactrian camel, which would go on to enable long-distance trade across all of Asia. They were some of the earliest adopters of domesticated horses, given their proximity to the steppe, which is where Proto-Indo-European speakers, or their ancestors, first wrangled humanity's favorite four-legged vehicle. The Oxus decline neatly aligns with the arrival of the Andronovo culture, and by extension, the Indo-Iranian language. Right around 18 or 1900 BCE, Andronovo-style graves and trade goods began appearing just outside of Oxus cities, and over the next couple of centuries, those cities shrank while the semi-nomadic lifestyle expanded. There's a little evidence for intercultural violence, but we're not talking about sacked and pillaged cities. Instead, it seems more like environmental pressures, possibly the same ecological shifts that were affecting both the Indus Valley and the Elamites around the same time, were causing a shift in cultural attitudes around the Oxus. The simultaneous collapse of both the Indus and Oxus civilizations probably played a big, if academically unexplored, role in Elamite history. It just corresponds too well with the downturn of Elamite fortunes and a sudden shift towards much more aggressive policies in Mesopotamia for it not to be connected. Both Indic and Iranian languages share a number of words related to cities, agriculture, warfare, and even local geography that do not originate with other Indo-European languages. And why would they? The Indo-Iranians came from millennia of steppe nomads originating far, far to the west. None of those topics would have been described in their language before arriving outside the walls of the Oxus civilization. But since they are shared between Iran and India, they must have been introduced before the two groups split. The same words do not seem to be connected to any known language, but there is a great big Oxus-shaped hole sitting right in the middle of the timeline, with an unknown language and all of the ideas that these shared words describe. A little bit of that lost ancient tongue is probably preserved in modern languages like Persian and Hindi. But moving on, we follow the real people who actually called themselves Aryan further along their journey to the country that would eventually share their name. Early research on when the Indo-Iranians began moving into India and Iran worked from when the Rig Veda most likely developed, but that can only provide a rough estimate. However, 20th century research uncovered Vedic terminology dated to around 1500 BCE in a very surprising place, the Kingdom of Mitanni, a Bronze Age kingdom in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria. It bordered the Hittites and the old Assyrian Empire. Several Mitanni gods, royal names, and additional terminology, especially related to horses, is near identical to the language of the Rig Veda. The conclusion that most scholars have settled on is that not long before 1500 BCE, a migrating group of Indo-Iranians conquered Mitanni and became the ruling class. So it was their gods and names that appear on royal inscriptions. They would have brought the horse-dependent culture of the steppe with them, and so their language was preserved. That language is so close to the Rig Veda that it all but confirms a circa 1500 departure date for the whole Indo-Aryan branch. It is believed that the Mitanni went south and west, then around the southern coast of the Caspian Sea, while another migration, either splitting off from that group or leaving around the same time, went south and east across the Hindu Kush and into the Indian subcontinent. There, they gradually spread out and mixed with local populations over the following centuries, taking the traditions of the Rig Veda with them. Finally, another migration took place sometime between 1000 and 800 BCE. These were the Iranians. Some went south from the steppe and into the Zagros Mountains and Iranian Plateau. Others turned west and became the early Scythians, who would harry Greece and the Near East for centuries to come, as well as the Cimmerians, who assaulted Urartu, as mentioned in the last episode. This migration must have occurred prior to 800, because it is at that point that the Medes, Persians, and other historical tribes began appearing in Assyrian and Elamite records. Other early Iranians stayed behind on the central steppe, where they eventually developed into many of the local tribes that would harass settled society in the classical period. Now we have a good moment to transition between topics for the sort of remastered double episode. So, ads or take a break, and then on to documented history. I routinely wish that I knew more languages. Even right in the middle of the US, I run into Spanish speakers all the time, and my social media always has a little Persian, Arabic, some Dutch and German. Rosetta Stone does help. It's the most trusted language learning program after all. It's also conveniently available on desktop or on the go as an app and has some really cool features that truly immerse you in the language you're learning. Just the first steps, like learning a new alphabet and some simple phrases, helped open new doors, and Rosetta Stone is a great choice as the trusted expert in this for 30 years and millions of users with 25 languages available to learn. They focus on fast language acquisition without English translations to help you learn, speak, listen, and think in your new language while building long-term retention. Their true accent speech recognition also gives feedback on pronunciation, which can be really important for languages like Persian, where how you say something is very important. And on top of being available for desktop and mobile, you have the option to download lessons and take them offline. This is also all available at a steal. You can get lifetime membership, all 25 languages, for 50% off. Don't put off learning that new language. There's no better time than right now to get started. For a very limited time, History of Persia listeners can get Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership for 50% off. Visit rosettastone.com/today. That's 50% off unlimited access to 25 language courses for the rest of your life. Redeem your 50% off at rosettastone.com/today today. Full disclosure, this is the section of the remastered episode I really did rewrite almost entirely. Partly, as time went on, I just stayed really interested in the ancient Medes and did more detailed niche research. However, in just the last 5 years, a lot more information about the Medes, recorded in Assyrian sources, has started making its way into mainstream publications about the Persians, and it just became more available to me. This is where the story of the Persians' ancestors really intersects with our story from last time. Not long after entering the Zagros Mountains, the Iranian tribes came under the subjugation of the Assyrian Empire. They were forced to pay tribute, and the Persians, or what appears to be them, were listed as a tribe in the Zagros around 836 BCE on an Assyrian tribute list. Through similar lists, we can trace this Persian tribe, most likely still illiterate pastoralists, as they migrated south. By 820, a people called Parush were placed in the southern end of the Zagros mountain range. At this point, the Persians were not the most significant Iranian group. That honor falls to the Medes. Like the Persians, they were an Iranian group, or probably collection of groups, that came from the second southward migration out of the steppe. They settled primarily in the northern Zagros Mountains as their new homeland by the 8th century, and were developing their own kingdom with centralized power and governance by the beginning of the 7th. The main sources for the early history of the Medes are Assyrian records, the Babylonian Chronicles, and the histories of Herodotus. The latter is famous for being the first proper history, recounting past events by consulting primary and secondary sources. Herodotus was a Greek historian who moved throughout the Greek world during his life, but originated in Halicarnassus, a Greek city ruled by Persia during his lifetime. Unfortunately, Herodotus took great liberties and was influenced by folk tales that we will be dealing with for the first 200 years of our narrative. It was probably intended to be performed and presented orally, meaning that Herodotus embellished and filled in details as needed to complete a compelling story. So, I will share a version of Herodotus' story, reconciled with Near Eastern sources, along with some commentary on the historian's probable mistakes. And that will generally be my policy when dealing with him in the future, as well as most other ancient sources. Sometime around 700 BCE, a Median chieftain in the Zagros called Deokes, managed to bring the different Median tribes under his personal control. Herodotus tells us that he had been used as a neutral judge to mediate disputes by the surrounding villages, but he got fed up and quit that job, causing the whole region to fall into anarchy. To save themselves, Herodotus says the Medes chose Deokes as their king. More than likely, he did plenty of his own warring to bring Media under his control if he existed, and Herodotus was using the idea of a just and elected king as a Greek literary device. Deokes is credited with forming a royal bodyguard and either founding or expanding the new capital at the city of Ecbatana, which is roughly modern Hamadan. Given the supposed dates of his reign, which Herodotus indicates would have ended in 647 BCE, Deokes would almost immediately have become a vassal of the rapidly expanding Assyrian Empire. Some historians like to bring up a real Assyrian vassal in the region that eventually became Media around the same time as Deokes, who they called Diuku. Strictly speaking, Diuku was a Manian, a pre-Iranian culture around the border of modern Iran and Iraqi Kurdistan. They were later absorbed into the Medes. Diuku tried to raise a rebellion against the Assyrian conquerors, only to be dethroned and exiled. He's hardly the sort of person you expect to inspire legends of the great founder of a grand dynasty. The more likely explanation is that Diuku, or Deokes, was a name in use in the right area at the right time, for there to be another Median guy with the same name that had some historical legacy among his own people. And if the idea of it just being the same name and different guys sounds unsatisfying, just wait. Someday, everyone in the room will be named Mithridates. Herodotus tells us that Deokes was succeeded by his son Phraortes, possibly the same leader called Kashtaratu in Assyrian records. The new king is credited with expanding the Median kingdom and subjugating the surrounding Iranian tribes, including the Persians. Based on Herodotus's timeline, he would seem to be the king who put the final nail in the coffin for Elam. Last time, we saw how Ashurbanipal, sick and tired of the Elamites aiding Babylonian rebels, led his army all the way to the Elamite capital at Susa, sacked the city, and crushed Elam all the way out of the historical record. That was only a partial truth. Sacking one city doesn't undo a whole civilization overnight, but it did do enough damage that Elam never recovered. The records from inside Elam are not clear. There are a handful of royal stelae that could be from this time period, or from rebels in the Persian period, or even from earlier kings not recorded by Assyrian records. But the last one is at least less likely. One plausible explanation is that various factions within Elam fought for dominance in the intervening years, as civil wars usually cause disruption in record keeping. But this is at least an opportunity to bring the Persians into the story. Ashurbanipal's wars with Babylon and Elam lasted for almost 30 years, and in that time 11 kings rose and fell. Some died in battle, others underwent coups, and a few were just Assyrian puppets. One of those Assyrian puppet kings wrote back to his overlords in Nineveh, complaining that the Parsua, aka the Persians, were still raiding his territory. Apparently, the Persians and other Iranian tribes under Assyrian rule were sent to attack the Elamites from the north, while Assyria and Elam were still at war. But even after the Elamites nominally made peace, these Persians kept attacking. That is probably where Persia, or at least the home province of Parsa, came from. the Persians seized territory from the Elamites as Assyrian vassals, and if we follow Herodotus' story, they would have been acting under Median command. Sort of. King Phraortes is really where Herodotus' Median history falls apart, because, very importantly, Herodotus didn't know anything about Elam, the politics of 7th century West Asia, or even that the Medes had ever been Assyrian vassals. Instead, in Herodotus' story, Phraortes carried out the first major conquest beyond Media by conquering Persia, already neatly located in the same region that, as far as Herodotus knew, it had always been. But of course, we know from real contemporary local records that this was not the case. Then the Greek story gets even more confused, because it really feels like he just copied over the results from 3 different playthroughs of a choose-your-own-adventure book. In Herodotus' version of events, the great conqueror Phraortes led his troops west, Persians included, and besieged the Assyrian capital at Nineveh all by himself, only to be killed in a battle after a 22-year reign, 647 to 625. According to modern calculations working back from better-known dates of historical kings. Just to be clear, as far as any written history, or even any other evidence at all, is concerned, Phraortes absolutely did not besiege Nineveh in 625. Admittedly, Assyria wasn't quite what it used to be, but there's simply no way that an Iranian army marching up to the walls of the Assyrian capital at any point could go completely unnoticed in Mesopotamian records. However, it might loosely correspond to a historical figure named Kashtaretu, who was the real first ever recorded king of the Medes in Assyrian records and oracle prophecies from the reign of King Esarhaddon in the 670s, which would actually correspond nicely with Herodotus' Deokes. Apparently, Kashtaretu raised a rebellion from his home base along the upper Kark River, and unified the usually belligerent Median tribes and city-states to try and force the Assyrians out of their land. In the records we have, they even seem to have been winning. Esarhaddon was begging for prophecies from his oracles that would show he could defeat these Medes. However, we also know that the Assyrians continued claiming the Medes as vassals well after this point. And the Persians were very clearly Assyrian servants during their war with Elam. It's not impossible that this Kashtaretu managed to found and rule a kingdom that became the Median Empire of Herodotus, but only as a concession from the Assyrians after fighting for independence. It's also possible that he was just stomped into the dust and became a Median hero. There's even a reason that Herodotus could have confused Kashtaretu and Phraortes as names. It comes from a much later event in Persian history where a Median rebel born with the name Phraortes claimed the name Kashtareta as his royal name when proclaiming himself a new king of the Medes. I should also explain a bit about the Median Empire at the time of Herodotus' supposed Phraortes. Herodotus and many other Greek writers loved the idea that there was always one great empire that ruled, quote, all of Asia beyond the Halys. The Halys being a river in modern Turkey. They were basically imagined as slightly smaller than the Persian Empire in the West, but otherwise identical. The Greeks were never correct about this, just ignorant of West Asian history. Obviously, the Medes haven't reached their peak yet, but modern scholars are pretty certain that Media was never really an empire in the conventional sense. Occasionally, snippets of its organization do get through in much later sources, And what they show is a much looser structure somewhere between a confederation and a kingdom held together by a hodgepodge of direct conquest, marriage alliances, tribal loyalties, and vassal oaths. There's no evidence of any sort of central administrative system or even Median cultural influence over their subordinates. Just a general understanding that when the king of the Medes called, most of his neighbors were obliged to join him. After Phraortes, Herodotus introduces us to Cyaxares, called Uvakshtra by the Persians. Cyaxares was reportedly the son of Phraortes, who immediately led his army back west and resumed his father's siege of Nineveh. This siege didn't happen either. Again, it's still 625, the Assyrian records would notice that. They also would have noticed what happens next in the Greek story. Supposedly, Cyaxares was forced to break off the siege because a giant Scythian invasion came pouring out of the eastern steppe and conquered all of Media for a Scythian king called Madios. There's no evidence at all for what Herodotus describes. Like, it just doesn't exist. A number of historians point out that the name Madios really just sounds like a slightly different Greek translation of Mada, the actual Median name for the Medes. Mede the Scythian conquered the Medes doesn't make a ton of sense, so it's possible that Herodotus just really didn't understand a story when somebody was telling him. It will not be the last time we can blame something bizarre in the histories on Herodotus being way too confident in 6 months of Old Persian Duolingo. There's evidence from steppe nomad activity as mercenaries or bandits in the Near East at this time, but those were probably Cimmerians, the very same who sacked Urartu in the last episode. It's actually pretty likely that Herodotus was trying to record some variation of the story of Urartu being sacked, either by the Cimmerians or even sacked by them and then conquered by the Medes, which could explain King Madios. The Greeks quite simply did not know Urartu ever existed, and didn't have any actual explanation for how that region became part of the later Median and Persian empires. Trying to follow how exactly Herodotus dates the events in this period of supposed Median rule is not very clear. His wording doesn't show whether or not he's counting Cyaxares' reign to include that period, or including one bit of Cyaxares and then a second bit as one full count after the Scythian invasion, or really, we don't know. Since it's basically a myth, the important thing is what Cyaxares really did do as king, because he is a genuine historical figure. Around 616 BCE, the Median king was contacted with a proposal from his Babylonian counterpart. King Nabopolassar of Babylon requested Cyaxares as an ally for a bold plan. They were to invade the Assyrian Empire and conquer its vast territory. And this is where the story of the early Iron Age and the early Iranian tribes really intersects. Next time, we will follow the Medes and Babylonians as they crush the Assyrians and spread their own power westward, all across the ancient world. If you want more information about this podcast, you can go to historyofpersiapodcast.com. That's where you will find my bibliography, the Achaemenid family tree, and plenty of other things, including the support page, to financially support this project. There are all sorts of ways to do that, but most importantly, there's patreon.com/historyofpersia. You can sign up for a monthly subscription ranging from $1 to $20, and access to things like ad-free listening, bonus episodes, and discounted merchandise. Even if you don't want to subscribe, you can also visit the show's store, either through historyofpersiapodcast.com or historyofpersia.launchcart.com. You can also support this show for free by leaving a rating or review on your podcast app of choice. I always love to see your feedback, but even better than that, tell your friends to listen to the History of Persia. Share it on social media at History of Persia Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, and just History of Persia on Twitter, and everything else that's trying to be Twitter. Thank you all so much for listening to The History of Persia.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Grainger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.